Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third SELCAN webinar in the series. This one's around resource auditing, monitoring and measures. My name's Heather and I'm the Climate Change and Environment Officer for South and East Lincolnshire, and I help facilitate the running of the SELCAN network, who are your hosts today, along with my colleague David Knight from PECT. So who are SELCAN? We're a network of volunteer representatives from the private, public and third sector who come together to share best practice and expertise and drive forward action in relation to climate change. If you have any questions as we go through the session today, please pop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and without further ado, I'll hand over to David.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. So my name is David Knight, and we're here today to talk about resource auditing, monitoring and measuring. So just a bit about me. So my name is David Knight. I'm the Principal Environmental Consultant at PECT and at Investors in the Environment. And I've worked a decade now with organizations around environmental management. My main area of expertise is in carbon and energy management, but I have supported organizations in developing resource management processes and systems to support them in identifying opportunities for improvements. But really, alongside that, also the monitoring and tracking systems that allow them to assess their performance through the through the activity of setting targets and action plans. Cool. Okay, so what we're going to look at today is just to go through this sort of agenda. So we're going to look at resource management, what it is and why it's important, the principles of a management system. We're going to look at policy and staff engagements, look at resource review and the process that goes into understanding the resources you consume as an organization. We're going to look at data. We're also going to look at auditing and then discuss available support. One thing I always say at the beginning of these sort of sessions is, as organizations, you'll all be at different starting points in terms of the journey that you have in terms of managing yourself, whether that's around resource management, climate management, whether you have net zero targets or required to report under carbon reduction plans through your customers. The idea today is we're just going to look through the basics and fundamentals of what is resource management, why it's important, and the processes of going through setting that up. So it is really aimed at the sort of organizations that are starting this journey, or even some that may have already started and just looking for some hints and tips on ways in which they can progress it going forwards. So in terms of the need for resource management, I mean, data will support action, and most importantly, accurate data helps to make accurate decisions. So the more accurate your data is, the more you're able to actually act on that information in good faith. Targets are useful to track performance, and benchmarking targets consumption against business performance is a really useful tool to track how changes in your organization impacts the use of your resources. And that's the real key thing around resource management. It's not just about the resources you're using, but it's understanding how business activity, occupation of sites, or anything that's happening within your organization is affecting how those resources are being consumed. Auditing is a process that enables your organization to learn how resources are used, and it's part of the planning process. So ideally, this review should be documented and recorded for future review purposes. And the process should be conducted at regular periods, obviously to be decided by yourselves. And the review should consider the whole systems approach to start with, just to get a good idea of the organization itself. But eventually what you want to do is sort of refine that to individual elements of different systems to get a better understanding of sort of activities and processes you have on site. And what's really pivotal is that communication engagement is critical to achieving reductions. You know, with all the technology you want to introduce, with good engagements, good training and good staff communication, it'll ensure that anything you introduce in terms of actions or technologies will benefit and show reductions straight away. So in terms of what resource management is, I mean, really, you can't manage what you don't understand. So it's really important to understand, to build an understanding as to how you use your resources and why you use them in any particular way. And this helps you to identify what kind of technologies you have, what kind of processes you have, what kind of behaviors are in place. So actually understanding how staff are managing different processes and what kind of materials staff are using. And what you want to understand is what's currently happening and where there are opportunities to make improvements, and then what actions you need to actually bolster those improvements and make the reductions that you can achieve. Now, obviously, by doing this, what you're looking to do as organizations is to improve efficiencies, to improve optimization as an organization. And that has multiple benefits. One, obviously, by using less resources, it's a good cost saving exercise. So with organizations that we work with every year, on average, we see reductions of around about 3 to 5%. Sometimes more depending on the starting position. So efficiency savings can save up to 20%. But again, that realm already depends on where you're starting from and what kind of management systems you already have in place, whether they're actually physical systems or whether they're just sort of actions that you already have in the background that are running and managing things. Now, what we really want to do and sort of the journey that we're talking about today is to try and help you understand the benefits of having a management system, because ultimately, whilst we're looking at resource management today, that's one part of an overall management system. And what that system allows you to do is to really think about where you are as an organization. What is the context you have as an organization? Again, help you to build that understanding as to how and why you're operating the way you are and where those opportunities are, and then actually have a system behind it that every time an opportunity is recognized, there's an action, there's a target, there's communication, and we're driving through that continual improvement. So we're continually driving through that ability to reduce costs, but most importantly to become more competitive, particularly if you're looking at carbon reporting and you're looking to reduce your carbon footprint given requirements you may have by customers. By demonstrating that you're not only calculating your carbon emissions, but you're also demonstrating a reduction in those emissions through good resource management. It helps you to become a more competitive organization in the world of sustainability that exists at the moment. So when we look at the principles of a management system, all management systems follow the plan, do, check, act process. And so we break this down into different steps. So the planning stage is around policy. Now, policy is the driver. It shows the commitment of senior leadership. It involves the process of the environmental review, which we'll talk about in a moment. But what's really important is policy cannot just be lip service. It has to be actively managed, and there needs to be action that sits behind it. Now, most tenders, most bids at the moment are looking at what are you doing environmentally, but it's not just do you have a policy, it's what are you doing environmentally. So by having the policy, you demonstrate to your customers that you're taking this seriously, you have that commitment in place, and then by putting the right actions in place, you can then demonstrate that you're doing what your policy says, and it's not just a policy document. Then we look at resource management, which is what we're here to talk about today, and that's really the cornerstone of performance and data to help inform decision. Now, what's important under resource management is you do need to put in adequate resource. And what I mean by that is there needs to be adequate time allowance for individuals of your team to be able to manage the resources. And there might be some cost investment depending on the type of changes and opportunities you're looking at. So if technology needs to change, that is going to be an investment. But the idea would be that any changes you make are understood and costed in a way that you'll know that they're going to make a difference before you actually invest in them, which is the purpose of this. Targets and actions, look, they're there to help. They're a measurable performance indicator. So they're there to give you something to compare to. Actions are obviously what you're doing and tracking how those actions are being successful. And then the targets is the measurement you put behind that to understand how successful those actions are. And then communication, like I said, without communication on board, without your staff on board, it is going to take longer to make the changes that you need to make. So really by engaging with them, by looking at training opportunities, by really sort of getting them involved, it will make these changes a lot quicker. And then just a word of caution. So continuous improvement, the aim of the game is continued management, and tracking shows success. Now, what we want to do is we want to see continual improvement. So we always want to be looking at opportunities to make reductions, to improve the way that we're doing. The real catch to this is that we also need to understand that there is a point that you're going to get to where it's as low as you're going to be able to get to. And the reason I say it's a word of caution is because we don't want to get there too early and go, well, that's it, we can't go any further. There probably is always an opportunity to make improvements, but we just also have to understand there is always a limit to how far you can go. And that's really where that understanding helps, by knowing how much energy and how much resource you have to consume, and that's the target you need to get to, is how do you get to that point and what kind of opportunities you're going to put in place to get there. Okay, so starting off, just looking at the environmental policy, it's a really important part of the process. As I mentioned, it's the driver. It puts into context where you are as an organization. And really, as I said, your policy is your commitment. Now, this is a commitment both to your employees, but also to your stakeholders, your customers, your investors, etc. shows to your employees that you are committed to managing yourselves environmentally. Whether that driver is carbon, whether that driver is just, making reductions in costs, whatever it happens to be, your policy is that driver that shows we're committed to this. This is now part of our policy. We're going to be pushing forward to make these reductions. And more importantly, as I said, to your customers, to your investors, it again demonstrates that you have it. Now, we work with organizations that have a policy, but when we ask, are they actively managed? The policy is written a few years ago and hasn't been looked at since. This needs to become part of your active policy process. It must be updated at least annually. Whether you make any changes to or not, that's depending on what you do as an organization. But ideally, this policy should be active. It should be reviewed on an annual basis or a biannual basis, and should be updated in line with any sort of changes you make to your organization. It really needs to be clear and concise. We always talk about it being no more than, say, 2 A4 pages, 1 A4 if you can, but no more than 2. And again, really making it public. So once you have your environmental policy, putting it out there for everybody to see, showing to your customers, putting it on your website, making it sort of visible as much as possible so that everybody can see it and can see what you're doing or what your commitment is as an organization. Now, as I said, alongside the policy is really getting that change behavior in staff. Now, there are many approaches that an organization can take to engaging with staff. And one of the key things is that your employees, your teams better than any one of us can, because you work with them on a daily basis. So how you engage with them will depend on the organization. And I guess that sort of that culture you have and how the communication currently exists. Now, on the slide here, we've got a couple of things. Now, I always talk about is different organizational sizes will have different, shall we say, communication plans. So if you're a fairly larger organization, you might want to consider the left-hand side. So where we talk about a resource management team. So here what we want is key team members. So you might have facility managers or operators. There might be senior representatives across different departments in your organization. What you want to do is you want to create a team who is looking at yourselves environmentally, but has got the sort of the in-depth knowledge that you need to really understand opportunities, understand how things work, and to be able to contribute to any actions that you're going to put forward. For smaller organizations and for everybody else, what we want to look at is the right-hand side here, where actually as an organization, what you want to do, if you can't necessarily set up a resource management team, you definitely still want to set up a sort of a green champion, a sustainability team, or whatever you want to call it, but essentially a team that has got members of staff across the organization who are willing, who are, keen, who really are looking at opportunities, who want to help and support this in terms of actually driving those actions through the organization. This can't just be left to one person to try and do everything. It needs to be an organizational approach, and how you broach that sort of communication plan, like I say, is really up to you in terms of how your communication works. But actually having that representative, having those sort of, different members of staff on board, we found time and time again have proven very successful actually making changes and getting actions through to realize the opportunities that exist. Things that you can do as part of that engagement. So we're going to talk about auditing in a moment. So this is something that we generally suggest, actually getting the right sort of members of your team to go along and do a site review, to walk around the site, to have a look at what's going on, to see how things are operating, and to really get a sort of an understanding as where energy is being used, where there's waste, how the waste systems are working, that sort of thing. So one, it actually helps to open their eyes, but two, it gives you a resource that can actually go along and do these sort of audits for you. And this is to say, when we do on a regular basis, this would be something that you can engage your team members to consider. And alongside of that, as I mentioned, getting people on board, knowledge is absolutely key. Like for anybody who's watching this video, anybody who's on the site today, on the call today, is you're here to understand, you're here to learn, and that's really important that your staff have the same opportunities. So if you really want to make good changes in your sustainability journey, then they need to have the knowledge and skills behind them as well. So thinking about what kind of green skills are you lacking within the organization? Where are there knowledge gaps, and what training opportunities? Now, that could be, for example, if you consume a lot of energy, you might want to consider energy management training for the right members of staff. If it's just, you're working with an organization, it's just a good opportunity to get your staff upskilled in understanding. There's things like carbon literacy, which is a great sort of opportunity for people to understand more about the carbon conversation. And there's a whole range of different opportunities within that. And then also within Invest in the Environment, we offer a Green Champion course, which actually helps organizations to understand the basis of an environmental management system. So how to set one up, what kind of process. So a bit of what we're talking about today, but just a bit more detail around it. There's a training opportunity for your members of your staff to go onto it and get that sort of background knowledge. They can then support you in delivering these sort of opportunities within your organizations. Okay, so as I said, policy is fundamental, is a key driver to it. As part of that policy, what we want to then is we want to think about the type of resources we're using. And this is where we start to do what we refer to as a resource review. So we want to first think about which resources are significant to us. What are the things that we want to measure? Which are the opportunities that exist to us? Where do we think the good opportunities lie? But as part of that review, we also want to think about not just which resources we're managing, but then also how are we using those resources? Why are they being used in this way? Is there opportunity? Are there wastes within that process? So what we talk about with organizations is to sort of do this sort of process where you think about yourself and you look at all the different resources that you consume, and then you look at which of those are significant. So for a lot of organizations we work with, the three main ones that we come across time and time again: electricity and gas, energy, travel and waste. So those are the three big significant ones that we have for organizations. The reason I put gas and electricity together is not organizations use gas, but energy, particularly travel, and then waste are the three biggest ones that we tend to come across time again. So those are the ones that most organizations starting out would use as their first sort of port of call. Water, procurement, those sort of things can come on board later on, but it's really just thinking about what's most important to you. So if we look at electricity as an example, you then want to think about all of the distant systems within your building that are using electricity. So you've got lighting, IT equipment, you've got, there might even be sort of air handling systems. You may have, if you're manufacturing, you'll have machinery, plant, technology, all these sort of things that are using electricity. And each of those will have different operational processes. So for example, if you're electrically heated, that's a process around heating. So what kind of technology do you have that's driving the heating? Do they have controls? Do they have timers? What are the behaviors that sit around that heating system? So you can see how you take the broad context of electricity, you break it down into the different sections, and then you look at each of those different sections as to what's happening, how are they being controlled, and who's responsible for that control. We'll talk about more about that when we come to the audit part. This is just a sort of an idea exercise to sort of start to get the framework of what you want to measure. And then what we do from the rest of today's webinar will be focused on how you start to put, information into those boxes to help you then start to make decisions and where there's opportunities. So just in this one here, for example, we take lighting. How much of your lighting is LED? Do you have sensors? Do people leave lights on in places where they could turn stuff off? So immediately there, if you're not fully LED, there's an opportunity. If you haven't got sensors in places, there's an opportunity. If people are leaving lights on, there's an opportunity. So you can see how you can already start to build up an action plan just by going through this exercise. Now, it's important in terms of information. So once you've got an idea of all the resources you're going to measure and a bit of idea in terms of how they're being used on site, we now want data to understand what is being consumed and how much of that resource we are consuming. So it's really important that we start to build data. Now, data is vitally important. Without it, you're basically taking a stab in the dark. Now, for a lot of organizations we work with, they do have actions, they are doing things, but often it feels more organic. It's just, they kind of thought, oh, we should probably do this, and they've done it. Now, it has proved effective, but what we want to try to get to do is to build a sort of approach where every decision you're making is understood, costed, and is going to make the benefit, and what benefit it's going to make as well. And that's the process of what we're looking to develop. Additionally, when you are putting actions in place, that data and understanding the reductions that are possible, which is where target setting comes into play, is we want to track to ensure that the changes we've introduced are making the reductions we anticipate. Because if we're not hitting those targets, then either the technology hasn't been installed correctly, maybe there's a training need behind the technology, or there's something else that's going on that you need to address to help to make those reductions. So this is why action planning and target setting sit hand in hand alongside each other. We're not going to go into that in too much in detail today, but that's really the reason why targets and actions are in place. But we need that data to measure against to understand where there's performance opportunities and if things are going the way that they should be going. Now, as always, when we talk about data, we're always talking about baseline data. This is particularly, it's always good to understand where you are to where you need to be. I talk about timeframes, 5-year timeframes. I think they're just really good examples for businesses to think about. What we do on an annual basis is our day-to-day, understood, and I appreciate that. We need to go on an annual basis, but most changes will take time to implement. So yes, we want to drive through an annual change, but we also have to understand that business activity changes on an annual basis. So by looking at yourself over a 5-year period, even a 3-year period, if you want to make it a bit more streamlined, gives you an opportunity to check trends. So we might not necessarily reduce as much as we want to in the first year, But the idea is to get where we need to be by the 5th year. So it might be only a decrease by 1% in the first year, 3% in the second year, maybe a percent increase in the third year, but then another 4% decrease in the 4th year. So you'll go up and down in terms of your performance. But by the time you get to your 5th year, you've already seen that general trend of reductions happening. And that's where baselines are really important. For anybody who needs the report under any carbon process, whether it's a carbon reduction plan or for a net zero agenda, you have to have a baseline in place to track your carbon performance over time as well. Now, again, I always put the slide up there in terms of recording data. So having a look at the data is one thing, but we need to record it in a way that we can review it and we can compare it. So as a minimum, we should be ideally recording data quarterly. I appreciate some resources might be more problematic and need to be recorded slightly differently. Monthly is ideal. That's really where we want to get to. And for energy, if you can get half hourly, that's even more fantastic. But really, realistically speaking, quarterly is ideal in terms of whenever time you're doing a review, a quarterly profile is good enough because, again, it gives you those 3 months to introduce actions, to check how things are performing, to look at your data at that point as well. So while you might want to record your information monthly, quarterly is a good opportunity to look at the information and actually review it. Digital recording is better. So obviously there's opportunities to use things like spreadsheets or sheets, but if you have got a sort of a portal or an online portal, if particularly if energy is a thing that you're looking at, speak to your supplier. Maybe they have a method of recording your data in a way that you can use it and make decisions and information from it as well. But most importantly, you need to have a comparable recording process to be able to compare this month to last month, this year to last year, and recognize those opportunities and reductions that you're making overall. Okay, so in terms of where to start, so for many organizations, when you're looking at your resources, where do you get that data from? So obviously for energy, you're looking at utility bills. It's a good place to start. Ideally, meter reading, they are more accurate. If you haven't got a smart meter in place, I would both look at meter readings and utility bills. We'll talk about that a bit in a minute. But things like travel, so you could be looking at expense claims. So anybody who travels for your organization, they'll obviously put in an expense to claim the mileage back. So that's a good place to get that information from. Water, utility bills, and meter reads. Waste is can be a little bit more complicated. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then for anybody who's looking at procurement, obviously expenses and invoices, etc. So the other thing to consider is when you're thinking about which resources to measure first is what kind of data do you have available to you? What's easy to get data? And that's sometimes a good place to start, just what's readily available for us and what can we start to collect almost straight away. Now, as I mentioned before, in terms of when we are looking at utility bills and meter readings, is you want to check your bills to ensure that you're not having estimated bills. And that's really important because if you are being estimated, there's always the potential that you could be underestimated, which means you'll be hit with a higher bill, or overestimated, which means you'll be paying more for the months until they realize what the correct meter reading was. And yes, you get that money back, but for those 3 or 4 months that you've been overcharged, that's money you could have probably done something else with. So if you are having estimated bills, then actually regularly taking your meter reading and sending it off to your energy provider is always recommended, particularly with gas. And we see this quite a lot with gas. Electricity tends to be a bit, some do, some don't, but gas, we tend to find the majority of gas bills seem to be estimated. So that's one definitely to look at if you are consuming gas. However, do you have a smart meter? That's something that I would recommend all organizations look at, particularly small organizations. And for larger organizations, do you have a half-hourly meter? And if you have a half-hourly meter, are you using that data? Now, smart meters are half-hourly, and if you have got a smart meter, you are entitled to your data. So you can put a request into your energy supplier to request the last 12 months of your smart data, which will be broken down into half-hourly increments. And as of October this year, energy providers who have smart meters installed will be able to provide you half-hourly data going forward. So it's really important that if you're a smaller organization, look to get a smart meter installed as part of the smart meter rollout. And once you have that installed, make sure you're accessing that data and getting half-hourly data. Half-hourly data is phenomenal in understanding how and when you're using energy across your site. If you're not sure what kind of meter you have, on any energy bill in the top right corner here, there's what we call an NPAN number, or a meter point administration number. And what you're looking for is this profile class. So this 00 number here, that represents that you have a half-hourly meter. Other things to think about as well for smaller businesses is if you have an 04 meter, so if that profile class is 04, then you have got a dual rate meter, which means you'd be charged a day rate and a night rate, or sometimes even a weekend rate. And that's important as well, because it's worth looking, if you have got a day and night rates, actually looking at both of those, because night rate is midnight till 7 in the morning, so generally when you're not operating, so the amount of energy you're consuming during those hours is effectively wasted energy. So driving down those night times, really looking at your shutdown procedure, is absolutely pivotal in terms of ways to reduce energy at a time when you're not actually doing anything as an organization. So yes, as meter you have, what opportunities are available to you. If you can get a smart meter, get a smart meter. And if you have got half hourly, speak to your provider to get a hold of your half hourly data. Now, the reason for that is because, and we'll talk about it in a minute, I'll show you how you can use half hourly data, but it's really important because it gives you a great profile as to how and when you're using energy, and particularly in those shutdown hours outside of operational hours, where there's a lot of wasted energy for organizations and opportunities to make improvements outside of those realms. If you have large energy demands, so if you're over 70 kVA, effectively 70 kilowatts a draw on the line, or capacity as they call it, you should have a half hourly meter already in place. So again, speak to your supplier to get that information. Okay. In terms of when we're thinking about measuring resources, a few things just to consider. I mean, electricity is fairly straightforward. Your meter reading is just a measurement of the amount of energy you're consuming. So meter reading on one day to meter reading the next day, the difference between it is the amount of energy consumed. And like I said, if you have got a day night, you'll have two rates on your meter. And that's really important to assess outside of operational hour energy consuming. Natural gas, your utility bill will give it to you in kilowatt hours, but your meter read is a volume flow. So it'll show you the meter volume of your gas. So if you go from energy bills to meter reads, just be aware that they're not the same numbers, and you'll need to convert your meter to kilowatt hours if you are going to change from one source to the other. Oil, for organizations that aren't on a gas grid and purchase oil in, typically you buy them in liters and your tank gets filled. As a way to become more aware of how much oil you're actually consuming, there are flow rate meters you can install, which will massively improve your accuracy of measurements. Otherwise, you just have 1,000 liters bought in January, another 1,000 bought in March, and then you won't buy something again until the October, maybe 1,500 liters at that point. But you have no idea how much you've actually consumed within that, just when you've bought oil at bulk. Now, water for many organizations, this can be problematic. We work with a number of organizations that really struggle either to access their meters because they're in a bush somewhere or in the middle of a road somewhere and just are unsafe to access, and we have seen this with a number of organizations, nobody actually knows where their water meter is. It's important, particularly looking at water, to see if you are getting estimated bills. And for anybody, just to be aware that on the water market, there is an opportunity to shop for an alternative provider and actually look to see if they can install smart water reading, so you're able to get that information through. And it's really important, particularly when it comes to water leaks, because we've seen organizations hit with some significant bills because they didn't realize they had a water leak because they weren't actively looking at their water meters. So it's really important that if you have if you use water, particularly if you use quite a lot of water, that you have got access to that information. And so looking at what opportunities through providers there are in terms of smart metering is a good thing to consider. And then for waste, whilst waste is a great one to do in terms of resource measurements, it also can be quite complicated because most contractors can't provide you with the actual weight of your lift. What they can do is give you the average weight of the total lift. So all of the different businesses they've been to on that day, they'll give you an average weight. Now, there are ways in which you can prove that. You can either accurately measure yourself through physically weighing your own waste, which is great. It's very accurate, but it's quite time consuming. So often it's not one that many organizations tend to do unless you're fairly small. There are use of density factors. So you can look at how you can just look at the total amount of bags that you have, for example, and apply a density factor to give you an average weight. So it's very inaccurate. It's quite subjective, but it does give you something you can measure, particularly if you're looking to convert that into carbon for any sort of carbon reporting as well. Okay, so once you have your data, as I said, we want to record it in such a way that we can start to look at it, and then we start what we want to then start doing is interpreting our data. So We'll talk about it a little bit, but remember I said about the environmental review, understanding how and why we're using our resources in a particular way, and then we want to look at that data to really start to recognize what's actually happening, what's going on, when are we consuming more. So this is energy data. We've got just a standard meter. This is just a community hall that we worked with on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side was a sports club that we worked with. The reason for the different profiles on the left-hand side, this is just they have gas heating and electrical supply. On the right-hand side, they were fully electric, so they had a heat pump in situ. So as we can see with the heat pump, in winter you use more energy, and in summer you use less because obviously the heat demand. But what we did is we looked at the organization, we looked at opportunities, and we saw straight away in the winter period for the community hall, December was really high. So we started to look at what was going on. So there was an increase in activity, obviously during the Christmas period, but we also found that a number of staff were using electric heaters, particularly during the winter in December, because they were cold. So not only were they heating themselves with gas and therefore using energy for that, they were also then plugging in electrical heaters and therefore using two energy sources to provide heat. So there's an opportunity to think about how can they improve their gas system to actually remove their electric heaters, which cost more to run, and effectively you're paying twice to heat the building. On the right hand side, this was a heat pump, really sort of ground source heat pump, really efficient system. But what we found when we did the walk around was doors were being left open. So whilst it was a sports club, a gym, so to speak, so obviously there were people coming in and out, none of the doors had automatic closes on them, so they were being propped open or just left open, which meant you were heating the space and people were just opening the door, leaving it open and walking away. So all that heat was just escaping. So a really efficient system, but a really poor operational process. So again, by doing those walkarounds, by looking at the data, by understanding how and why things are happening, you can start to identify where there might be opportunities to improve the systems you have and reduce the amount of energy that you're consuming. So half hourly data, and this is where the benefits of half hourly data. So in those ones, we see you have big sort of data sets. So it's quite hard to go in a really sort of granular level, specific level. But when you've got half hourly, you can really look at every single point energy is being consumed. So straight away with this example here, a manufacturing company we work with, as we can see, you know, they tend to start switching things on around about 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning. But between midnight and 4 o'clock, there's huge spikes in energy of which we don't see in the evening. So what's happening between midnight and 4 o'clock when there's nothing in operation that's causing these energy spikes? We also see some spikes on the, oh, it's not actually on yet, sorry. On the Sunday, there was a spike in the morning at around about 5:30. Every Sunday at around about 5:30, there's a spike in energy for again, no reason whatsoever. So as we can see with half hourly, you can really start to break down what's happening at different times, and we can start to see where there's anomalies within our energy data. One thing I always do with my half hourly data is I turn it into this, which I refer to as my heat map, and it allows me to really sort of understand what's going on with the energy. So this top one here, as we can see, is an example of a manufacturing organization which doesn't have amazing shutdown processes, and the example underneath is a manufacturing organization which had some of the best shutdown procedures we'd seen in terms of how low their energy consumption was outside of their operational hours. And so here we can see the opportunity by seeing when and how energy is being wasted, what can be achieved against what's actually happening. And without looking at that data, you would never know that this was happening within your energy, because you're just so used to seeing those bars on the graph in terms of big overall months rather than really looking at the specifics. So here we could see straight away 2 o'clock in the morning, there's a system that's switching on, running for half an hour. On Mondays, particularly, it tended to run a bit longer. So it would start at 2 and run all the way through. And as we can see, you know, Saturdays, when they weren't in operation, systems being left on, versus a Sunday when things are switched off. So we can see there's lots of opportunity for this organization to make reductions just through checking what's happening when the site shuts down and what systems they have in operation in terms of timers, in terms of machinery, equipment, or anything that's on site, as a way to actually save quite a lot of money through very simple, low cost, no cost actions as well. So that's really the benefit of half hourly. So you have access to the data. It's recommended that you do start to look at it. This is just a case of putting it into a spreadsheet and applying a sort of coloration to maximums and minimums, and it gives you this kind of data to be able to start to make decisions on. Gas as well. So very similarly with gas, you know, we'll always see this trend high in the winter, low in the summer. This organization we worked with, they have hot water systems, so they're always going to be consuming gas in the summer, but that's something that we would look at. What kind of hot water systems do you have? Are you using too much hot water in the summer months? Could you look at a better system? But again, you can see here, now we're looking at 1 year to the second year in terms of how we're performing against each month and where there might be opportunities, or why some months are higher than other months 1 year to the next as well. Now, when we're looking at data, one thing to always consider, as I mentioned before, is, the amount of resources you consume will be reflective on your business activity. So if you're running longer hours, you're going to use more energy. If you're increasing in size, all these sort of things that could potentially happen as an organization will have an impact on the amount of resources you use. So benchmarking your activity against your business activity is something to consider. And one key thing I'll talk about in the next couple of slides is particularly on gas. If you're solely using gas for heating, it's important to understand that the colder it is outside, the more gas you're going to consume on the inside. So a really mild winter will show a good reduction in gas, but if you then have a really cold winter the next year, you're going to see an increase. So what you can do is actually compare your gas consumption against outside temperatures, the process called degree day analysis. And what this will show you is how well your control systems are operating. So this is a site that we worked with. They had no control systems. Again, it was a communal building. People could come in and turn the heating systems on. There was no checkup afterwards. And we found that the heating system was basically being switched on. People were leaving and no one was going in afterwards to switch it off. So it'd be running for maybe a whole weekend before anybody actually went in to switch it off. So again, no control system. So real opportunity for them was to centralize their control, to put in a sort of a remote control process where someone could actually look at it remotely, so didn't have to go to site to control things. And it meant that things wouldn't get left on. So real opportunity to save energy. And here's an example. We worked with an organization which actually had a very good control system. So this is the one we showed in the gas example previously. So high in the summer, high in the winter, low in the summer. So whilst they were consuming a lot of gas, however, their control of how they were operating the heat and when heating was switched on was absolutely spot on. So really good control system versus the amount of heat that they were consuming, which shows that actually the controls they had in place were operating effectively and efficiently. So there was nothing that they needed to do around that. It was more around actually building structure in terms of the insulation they have within the building to try and bring the energy levels down would be their best opportunity to make reductions. One thing, again, just while we're talking about metering, is to think about sub-meters. So I don't recommend this for all organizations. I really recommend this is where you have high energy processes that you want to try and isolate. So the information we've been looking at so far is everything, all of the energy consumed within a site. Now, if you've got mixed operations, maybe you've got an office site and a manufacturing part of the facility, you just get one energy data set. So it's hard to see actually what's happening in the offices versus what's happening within the factory. So by actually collaring and separating out that data, it allows you to look at actions that are relevant for the office and how you can drive down efficiencies in there, and operations that are happening within the factory and the sort of the manufacturing part of your organization, and then again looking at activities and how you can drive down there. So there are opportunities for sub-meters in buildings like that. So I don't recommend them everywhere, but if you have got, if you want to look at a specific system, if you want to look at different parts of your building, you can rent sub-meters. You don't have to purchase them. So you could do projects to look at energies across different parts of your organization to get a good understanding as to what's happening and where opportunities are to make improvements. Okay, so we've looked at obviously policy to drive through. We've looked at engagement to get staff on board to help to mitigate actions. We've started to look at which kind of resources you might want to measure, and then looking at how you can start to look at data and apply that to your organization. And this is where the auditing comes in, is now we want to understand what's happening on site and how that data relates to business operation. And that's what auditing does. So when we approach auditing, there's a sort of, I guess the thing to think about. Now, this is something that myself as an auditor would come into a site, and this is the process we would follow. And so it's a good opportunity for you as an organization to think about applying the same sort of process. So first of all, what is it that we want to check? Are we going to look at the entire building? Are we going to look at a specific system? Maybe you just want to look at your heating system. So the audit today is just to look at heating, and that's what we're going to look at. So who needs to be involved in that? Who's got data? Who's got knowledge in terms of the different pieces of equipment, or how the system works, or what the timers or controls do? So who needs to be involved in that conversation or as part of that audit? We then obviously, as we've been talking about, you want to collect and analyze the data. So, have you got our gas bills? Can we start to look at it? Is there anything we can do to break it down? Could we do a degree day analysis to understand, is there a problem with our control systems, etc.? So you might want to look at historical data, maybe going over the past 2 years to see if there's any general trends. You might also want to think about, is there any sort of equipment data sets or systems data sets? How well are these systems being maintained? Are the boilers up to scratch? How old are they? How efficient are they? These sort of things. So think about what it is you want to do, who needs to be involved, and what kind of information do you need to start that initial analysis in terms of what's happening. Then you want to obviously conduct the audit. So go around and have a look at the different things, look at the different pieces of equipment. So we look at the boiler, what's the boiler doing? How is it operating? We look at the control systems, what are they doing? How are they operating? We look at the radiators, do they have TRVs? Are the radiator valves on? Are there thermostats in different rooms? Are some places colder than others, etc.? So now we walk around the site and look at the different elements to get an understanding as to what's actually happening. Whilst you're doing that, you'll want to be thinking about where there's opportunities. So if you walk into a specific room and it's really cold in that room, even though the radiator is on full blast, well, then there's an opportunity. Why is that room cold? Could it be that there's check the windows, check the frames? Is there a door that gets open? Is there an access problem? Maybe people are going through their door all the time, which just means all the heat in there is being wasted. So is there opportunities to change the heating in this room? Are we heating storerooms that don't need to be heated? So we could maybe turn the radiators down in those places. So thinking about, as you're walking around, is it doing what we expect it to be doing, and can we make any changes? And then you want to start to build your action plan. So once you identify something, write it down, and then start to think about what kind of actions you can put in place, what's going to be quick and can be done almost straight away without any investments, and what might need to, maybe will require some training, it might require some investment. So what are your larger objectives, and start to build that as part of your actions. So when you are walking around, sort of general questions you can ask, so this is looking specifically at energy, is first of all, what is the process or operation? So we talk about heating. So what is the heating system like? What equipment is used to achieve that function? What is the age and the efficiency of that equipment? And then does that need replacing? Is it old? Is it inefficient? Could we look at a new one? What's the return on investment if we do that? You also want to think about, how does occupational business activity affect that operation? So again, if you're looking at heating particularly, business activity probably has less impact on it, but occupation does. So which parts of our building are being occupied and therefore need to be heated, and which parts aren't? Particularly if you've got factory warehousing and you're trying to heat the entire space, does the entire space need to be heated? If you have access, so for example, if you have a loading area or reception area, the doors are constantly being opened and you're trying to heat the space, and all you're doing is letting the heat escape out the doors that keep being opened, is there an opportunity to improve the heating within that? You also want to think about, what are the behaviors of staff? So are staff turning the heating up? And again, the amount of places we've been to where heating's been turned up to 24 because the staff felt cold when they first walked in the morning. And what are the control systems in operation? So is it a single thermostat? Do you have zonal heating? How is the temperatures being set? How are they being monitored? So can they be improved? And most importantly, what does shutdown look like? When does your heating system switch off at the end of the day? Are people responsible for that? Is anybody checking that? So like we saw within the graphs, there's real opportunity outside of operational hours to make those reductions when doing that. And then similarly, when it comes to sort of waste auditing, we have the same sort of thing. So what kind of waste streams do we have? So first of all, what waste do we produce? What waste streams do we have? Are they fit for purpose? How well is waste being segregated? Could we improve that? So are we throwing stuff in the general waste that could go into recycling? Is there any sort of hazardous waste that we need to make sure we're managing correctly? And then how are we generating this waste? So where's it coming from? So is it the case of, are we buying materials in that are now becoming waste? Is that being brought in by staff? Is that something we're procuring in ourselves? Could we reduce or alter that, so therefore not produce this as a waste? And then any part of our process, what is it? So if we're manufacturing something and we have a large amount of offcuts, is there something within our process that we could potentially change to minimize the amount of waste? Could we buy something indifferent that's maybe a bit more, that's sized more appropriately, or maybe a bit more pre-manufactured to allow us to minimize the amount of waste that you're producing? One thing I always say with organizations is that waste is a double cost, because you've paid for something to come into the organization, and now you're paying for the waste to leave the organization. So you're paying for it twice. So really looking at opportunities to minimize your waste is vital, because one, it can help to protect yourself against legislation, regulation around waste, but two, it helps to reduce costs that you effectively are paying twice. Now, Sorry, just given time, I am just going to go through this. As I said, these will be available, but really what we want to start to think about when it comes to waste is thinking about the circular economy. So linear economy is where we buy something, we use something, we throw it away. We have recycling economy, which is we buy something, we put it back in the system to recycle, but eventually it's going to end up becoming waste anyway. And the circular economy is really thinking about how we keep things in the system as long as possible so that we actually generate the least amount of waste possible. So when it comes to the circular economy, we want to think about the 7 Rs. So refurbish, return, recycle, rethink, reduce, repair, and reuse. So it's not just the reduce, reuse, recycle. There's lots more to the circular economy that we need to think about. Can we use refurbished materials rather than virgin materials? Is there a return policy? Can we rethink our processes? Could we repair this instead? So when we're talking circular economy, we want to think about how we start to apply the practice of this. So rethink, reduce, reuse, refurbish, repair, recycle, return. So when we're rethinking reducing, we're designing out waste. So in terms of our operations, can we look to how we design out waste? So is there a way that we can improve our processes to minimize the amount of waste we're producing? Can we reuse it? Can we refurbish it? Can we repair it? So keeping materials in use. And as the last resort, can we recycle it? Or can it be returned? So again, if we're getting something in, there's an opportunity for us to send it back. Could we lease something rather than buying it? So that way we're not actually bringing something in new, we're using something for a while we need it, and we can then return it. So when it comes to rethink and reduce, obviously we want to think the way we make things. We might want to reduce reliance on virgin materials or explore more sustainable alternatives. The reuse and repair, recycle, again, thinking about how can we pass these products on to another purpose? How can we refurbish them to keep them going? How can we repair them to make them last longer? And then obviously look to recycle. And then return structures. What can we do with end of life stuff? Can someone else use this material rather than it just becoming a waste? Can it actually become a resource rather than a waste? Could we potentially get something and return it back to the person who gave it to us? Could we pass it on to someone else? All these sort of things. And how do we keep things in the cycle for as long as possible to ensure that we're keeping that circularity within the waste stream? And like I said, waste is a double cost, so we can turn that into a resource that now actually brings us an extra benefit rather than just throwing it away. So just as some example, when we look at waste auditing, so, a company can identify its waste streams from production to offices and find that actually there might be some process that you can review to design out waste. So we worked with a college, and what they found was a lot of the waste that was being generated came from their canteen. So working with the canteen, they found a way to actually reduce waste by using reusable plates and materials rather than just throwing out the polystyrene that was currently being used at the time. Could you lease it rather than purchase it? Are there refill options rather than just, so again, working to buy in bulk cleaning materials rather than individual bottles to minimize waste in that respect. But then thinking about waste as a resource. So here's an example, and a smart startup SEN looked at Hessian coffee sacks. So it took a waste from another organization and started to manufacture unique products from that. So, is there another company that can take your waste and turn it into something? Or maybe it's a case of actually you as a manufacturer could look for materials that are effectively waste from other organizations and start to use them themselves. So really thinking about that circular economy. So when we're starting to audit, we want to think about tools that we need to use. So obviously everything wants to be documented. Photos are a great way of doing it, and then there might be additional equipment that you could consider. So for example, if you're looking at lighting, you might think about a light meter, or certainly if you get someone in to look at your lighting, they should bring in a light meter. Infrared cameras are amazing tools if you want to look at your insulation, if you want to look at your heating plant and really look at where heat's being lost. I mentioned already about sort of multi-clamp meters, sub-meters, so putting in meters along different systems to see how much energy. If you have a compressor system, speaking to your supplier to come in and do a service check to see how your compressor systems are operating and where there's opportunities for improvements. And if you are doing a waste audit, thinking about weighing scales to weigh up significant streams of waste as to how much volume you have in those areas. Now, whenever we're thinking about auditing, what we want to think about is where is there an opportunity to make improvements, so optimization or efficiency improvements. If it's efficient as we can be, it might be actually we want to look at replacing the asset. So is it old? Is it obsolete? We need to look at a new one. Is that more efficient than what we're currently using? And then as a final recommendation, particularly in energy, is can we start to generate that energy ourselves? So yeah, optimization should always be the first port of call. That's really where the low cost, no cost options sit. Asset replacement requires a bit more investment, and energy generation requires a significant more amount of investment. So actually getting the first two in the place first is recommended rather than just going straight to generation. And then when we're talking about recommendations, try and stick to what's happening, try not to make too many assumptions, consider what the purpose of the audit was in terms of what you put forward, but always thinking about, can the monitoring be improved? Could the equipment be replaced? Is there optimization available to it? Is there anything innovative that we could look at and introducing, or could we look at generation on site? And those are the sort of the hierarchy of recommendations we would make. And then these are just sort of, so we say, typical actions that we recommend for most organizations. So LED lighting, sensors, switch off campaigns, particularly around lighting, maybe timed plugs for equipment, looking at the controls on your heating, etc. And then building an asset list as well. So what do you have on site that consumes energy? How efficient is that? When was it, when was it maintained? How old is it? That kind of thing. For hot water, mostly with hot water systems is, do you have the right system for your need? Do you have a large water tank when actually all you're doing is washing a few plates and bowls up, and maybe a point of use heater would be better? Always thinking about leaks, particularly in heated systems. If you have travel needs, thinking about doing surveys, thinking about vehicle trackers. For heating, what are your heating needs? So like I said before, are you heating an entire space that doesn't need it? Are you heating rooms that don't need to be heated? Are your timers operational? What kind of thermostats do you have? Are you zonally controlled? What kind of control systems do you have in terms of managing how and when heating is applied? Are you insulating your pipes, what's your building's insulation like, etc.? So these are general actions that we'd recommend to most organizations when we see them, when we go out to them, things for them to consider. So again, when you're looking at this, these could be options to consider going forwards. And then just in terms of the circular economy, so really, I mean, it does sit probably more with manufacturers, particularly where you are using materials, but it's also important for us as consumers as well to think about how we can start to think about our processes to avoid things happening, to try and minimize the amount of waste that we're producing as organizations. Okay, so that's the management in terms of data. The last few slides I just want to go through are just sort of, I guess, checklists. So when we're doing the auditing and going through things, just things that we can consider. I am going to go through this fairly quickly just because of time. But again, these are useful. So if you're watching this video back, you can pause it and go through. These are the sort of questions you want to think about. So when it comes to controls are the first place to look. And actually up to 20% of efficiencies can be made through just improving your controls. And the key question is, what is the control's purpose? Is it checking time, temperature, speed, and is it performing as expected? And you'll see throughout, that's the question we was asking. Is our expectations being met by our system? So first thing is there an occupancy need? So are our lighting on when it doesn't need to be? So could we put a sensor in place, for people moving in and out spaces, corridors, particularly bathrooms, etc.? And does the control match this? If it doesn't, can we improve it? And also thinking about what still operates outside of operational hours. And also for organizations, what are your external lighting? What is your external lighting doing? Do you have timers on your external lights? Are they turning on and just not turning off over the nighttime? Things to think about. Then we also want to think about controls that manage different equipment. So is it on or off? Is it full speed, variable speed, modulated? Are our boilers just switched on? How do they operate? What does it work with? And again, does the control match what we want it to? And is there a better way to control either the occupancy of the equipment? And how easy is it to change that control systems? Now, controls are fairly low cost, so should for most organizations be financially viable. But again, it's always worth thinking, if we are going to do it, do we need an automated control, or could we work with a staff, our employees, to get a behavioral control, which will actually be a lower cost option for doing it? So when we're looking at heating and cooling, again, what kind of needs do you have? Why are we heating spaces? Why are we cooling spaces? Do we have lots of solar gain? So if we've got a south side building with lots of windows and therefore the room's getting really hot because we get a lot of sunlight. So could we put a film or a window or an awning above the window to prevent the sunlight coming in, which now means we don't need to cool it as much? Do we have cold rooms in our building? Could we do something about that? Could we improve how that room is utilized? What are the systems doing? Are they working? Are your boilers fit for purpose? And one question we always ask is, has your building use changed? So have you changed the layout of the building, but not changed the heating or cooling systems? And that's something really important. We've been to organizations where thermostats were located in a particular place, but when they changed the layout, the thermostat was in a different room to where the actual unit was. So always thinking about, if you have changed the building use, does the system reflect that? what are the behaviors around? What are the controls like? Where are your thermostats located? Are they located in direct sunlight? Are they located near equipment? Could we move the thermostats to better places to get a better feel of how the heating is operating within the space as well? In terms of temperature, I mean, for all the years I've been doing this, I've never come into a building where everybody's happy with the temperature. There's always people who are too hot and people who are too cold and people in the middle. And it's always been that sort of asterisk to it. But as a general rule of thumb, depending on the type of operation you have, there are recommendations to the type of temperature you may want to consider. And for every 1 degree lower, you're saving 8% of your heating. So if you can try and get that heating to 21, 22 degrees rather than 24, 25 degrees, you know, that's a significant saving you can make in your energy consumption just by doing that one simple thing. Building fabric, obviously, it's always important to understand what kind of building you're in, checking your windows and doors, seeing if the seals are still fitting, checking that there's no wind coming through. Again, walking through buildings and you put your hand next to the window, you can feel the air blowing through it and wondering why the space is cold. So these are things always to think about in terms of, if you can't necessarily put insulation in, making sure that what you do have in the fabric is operating the best it can, avoiding drafts, putting in draft excluders, you know, making sure the doors have seals in, and that sort of thing just helps to improve thermal comfort and helps to minimize complaints from members of the team. And then when it comes to lighting, the most important thing is, do you have lights on in places where they don't need to be on? Do you have, particularly now we work in a hybrid world, you have parts of your office which don't need to be lit versus other parts, but do your light switches just turn on the whole room where actually they could be separated out? And would sensors be a sensible thing to put in place? So for your corridors, could you put movement sensors in place? But in maybe your reception area, you've got lots of glazing. Maybe you could put a light sensor in where actually the lights don't need to be on because it's quite bright in that space, but obviously will get darker later. So lux sensors will allow the lights to track the external lighting and will adjust their how bright they are according to how well lit the space is from natural lighting. And then again, what's staff behaviors around it? Are they switching lights off? Are they leaving lights on in places where they possibly shouldn't be? So again, when you're walking around, these are things to consider. And then lastly, when it comes to generation, as I said, efficiency should always be prioritized, but it's not always possible to do that. So sometimes we might need to consider generation as the first port of call, and you know, it does come into play. So what is the need? Do we need electricity? Do we need heat? Do we need both? And what's the best system to put in place? And also, does the occupancy match the generation? So if you're going to put in solar PV, obviously you want to have a daytime operation. If you do a lot of your operation in the nighttime, solar PV is probably not going to be the best unless you then have battery storage with it. So again, things to consider. Is it possible? So are you actually able to put a PV system on? So you have to get a permission from the district network operator, the people who manage the grid. And then most importantly is, how are you going to tie that renewable energy into your operation to ensure that that energy flow through happens as well? So that's it in terms of the overall content. Apologies, I ran a little bit over time. Quite a big topic, to be fair, to get in an hour, but hopefully we've been able to cover quite a lot of everything that you're looking at. Now, what's really important is that there is support out there. So Tony Newell is our specialist, is the specialist environmental advisor for your area. He's working alongside Grants for Growth, and so what they're doing is they're having an advice side and a support side. So what Tony's able to do is actually come to your site, and everything we talked about today in carrying out an audit, that's what Tony is able to do for you. So if you're interested in someone coming out and conducting a site audit for you to get a better understanding as to how energy is being used, where those opportunities exist, they contact Grants for Growth and they'll be able to arrange a visit with Tony to be able to go through that information with you. Secondly, there's also then funding available from that, so you may be eligible for additional funding. One thing I will just mention is that a lot of what we talked about today in terms of developing that management system, the Investors in the Environment program, which I say which I work with, this is basically what we do with organizations. We help them to develop these systems. So there's onboard supports, there's toolkits, templates, and a whole range of different supporting paraphernalia that we provide to you, plus direct support from a member of the team. And more importantly is that is actually fundable through the Grants for Growth program, where they can fund up to 70% of the cost for your first year. So if you're interested in developing a management system, and a lot of what we spoke about today resonates, but you'd like a bit more support on that, then please have a look at Investors in the Environment or contact Grants for Growth to get an audit and also what support we could do to fund that as well. And at that point then, I'll just go back to the room to see if we have any questions.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic, really helpful. We don't have any questions from the chat today. Yeah, thank you. It was a really insightful presentation, and I think you've really highlighted just how many opportunities there are to make those efficiency savings. And in many cases, the measures that sort of arise from that work are often sort of fairly low cost and easy to implement as well, aren't they? So thank you. I think it was really informative session.
No, definitely, and thank you as well. So, okay, great. I'll just hand over to you then, Heather.
Lovely. Thanks, David. Yeah, thank you, David, for a fantastic presentation, and thank you to all that attended the session today. The final slide is just some upcoming sessions that we've got in the SELCAN webinar series. If you're interested in attending any of those, please get in touch with me via email, or equally, you can sign up through the registration form that you used for today. Thank you all. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks to everyone for attending today, and thanks for your time. Yeah, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions coming forward. And again, thanks, Heather, for the opportunity.